All right, how's it going, everyone? We have a guest with us today. Our guest is John. How are you today?
I'm doing good.
Awesome. Glad to hear it. So, how long have you been practicing for?
I have been, by the way, I can't see your face right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Interesting. Hmm.
let me see.
I'm
Ah,
not
here we go.
sure.
You're back.
Okay, that's
It
interesting.
was
I'm
a
not.
it was a weird notification from Zoom, and I had to just say got it, and then you're back.
Okay, awesome.
Okay.
All right. So, how long have you been practicing for?
Um, I've been practicing, I've been fooling around for a long time. So I
Hmm.
probably started fooling around like a lot of kids in high school. So that was probably like in the late 80s.
Okay.
And fooled around with the Necronomicon and Anton LaVey and
Interesting.
that typical sort of thing. Um, it never left, but there were longer periods where I kind of got sidetracked or I got
Mhm.
was exploring other things, art and writing and that kind of thing, philosophy. And but I would say I kind of got more serious in the last 20 years or so. And then I would say that the last 6 or 7 years have been increasingly more serious and more intense and more focused.
Okay. I find it's very common for people to take breaks, and a lot of people explain it as taking a break, but I find it's just looking at magic or life from a different perspective because
Absolutely.
magic can be found everywhere, especially in art and philosophy.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so you mentioned the Necronomicon and Anton LaVey. What other sorts of things, as well as those, interested you in magic to begin with?
Um, I think my initial interest probably came from my when I was quite a bit younger, and that was so both of my parents are Russian.
Mhm.
They come from they weren't born in Russia because their parents fled the Russian Revolution.
Mm,
So, and my parents are I mean, they both passed away, but they were basically a generation older than all of my peers in school. So my dad, for example, was born in 1927, and he was born in China. He experienced the Japanese occupation. My mother was born in 34, and she was born in Yugoslavia. And so she experienced the Nazi occupation, then the Soviet invasion, and blah, blah, blah. So their experiences were intense and formative. And especially my mom, she kind of downloaded some of her like war trauma onto
mhm.
me. I mean, I realize what it is now. I didn't realize what it was back then. And so these really intense Klepothic imagery was like imprinted on me at an early age.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. And my dad, he also grew up in a very intense part of the world because he grew up in Manchuria, which was under Japanese occupation, and some of the most horrific war crimes took place in Manchuria. There was a notorious Unit 731, which was a Japanese biological experimentation station. And it was like literally like 15 minutes outside of the city where he grew up.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So, and he never talked about anything. He was very clammed up about what he went through. But the energy that came off of him was palpable. He was one of those people I would call like a clandestine sorcerer. He just had it, whether it was running through the line or whether it was through his background or whatnot. He also was a Russian Orthodox priest.
Okay.
Okay. And he was also exposed to some very serious practitioners of the old school in the Russian Orthodox tradition. People
Hmm.
that came from Russia, serious ascetics, serious ritualists, basically people who were considered miracle workers. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So some powerful people. And so that kind of ended up in the line. And I think my interest was also sparked from that, even though it's like, yeah, I didn't go in the Christian or the Russian Orthodox direction. Although I did can't come close at one point. I actually went to a Russian Orthodox seminary. I actually finished a 5 year course in the Russian Orthodox tradition. So I
Okay.
did have that background. Um, and so my family background was very conservative, very traditional, and very religious.
Hmm.
My father being more explicitly religious than my mother, but
Okay.
she had like the war trauma and the whole experience with the Nazis and being bombed all the time and all that kind of stuff. And then I think the other thing that influenced me was basically seeing death up close as a kid. My dad's mom came to live with us in the early 80s. She had come over from Belgium. And I was probably like, I want to say 6 or 7 at the time. And not only was she dying, but she was having these crazy hallucinations. And now that
Mm.
I've done this work, I sometimes wonder, gee, were
Recognize.
they
Mhm.
hallucinations? I mean, one of the things that she would do is she would strike the walls of her room with her rubber tipped cane and yell, finish. Now, her English was terrible, and I think she meant stop.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
later, what she told her caretakers essentially was that the ceiling would open up, and these ghostly banshee-like horsemen and carriages, like imagine like ghostly 17th century carriages, would come out
Sure.
of the ceiling, and she would be terrified that they were taking her away. And many years later, I read about banshee legends,
Mhm.
and it's like, wow, people talk about these black coaches,
Mhm.
And so I thought, ooh, that's different. And so this made a strong impression on me as a kid.
Naturally.
Naturally.
Wow. So, okay. So, first of all, I guess I will address the Russian Orthodoxy priesthood. I know very little about it, but some of the pictures that I've seen of these priests are very solemn, very ascetic, like you said. Some of the pictures I've seen of some of they're not really tabards, but the cloaks they wear have lots of sacred images and
Yeah.
meaningful icons and
A
things on
lot of
them.
skulls. Yeah.
School, yeah, and that's the next thing I was gonna say was, I've seen inside and of some of the monasteries, and there's just walls of skulls, or they will be meditating or praying with skulls that were previous congregates or priests. I
Hmm.
think that's very meaningful and very
Yeah.
interesting.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Um, so yeah, and then basically after my grandmother passed away, and I remember like her last breath and how profound that was.
Mhm.
And after that, as I was going through grade school and high school, there was kind of a long stream of relatives that would come to the house to die. Several uncles, another grandmother, and then eventually, when I came back from seminary in the early 2000s, my mom got sick. She got cancer. She passed away. Then I think about must have been 10 years later, then my dad passed away. Then my wife's father passed away, and I kind of ended up in sort of like a psychopomp shamanic role with him, helping him to transition because he
Mhm.
was thrashing and thrashing for days and he couldn't make the transition. Okay, so I did what they do in the Orthodox Church, which is they read the Psalms over the dying person, and they say your hearing is the last of your senses to go. It's the last sense that remains connected to this plane. And it
Mhm.
was amazing. He just calmed right down. And I did it for one day. And he left that night when my wife was attending to him, basically. So that was interesting. And then after that, it's like, then my brother passed away. Then my older sister, my half sister passed away. So it's just like, you know, so there's been a lot of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I have some experience. You mentioned hearing being the last thing that goes. My grandfather, who was essentially like a father to me, because my father died when I was very young. My grandfather was sick. He had cancer and he was bedridden. And there was like a 3 day period where he didn't move. He was
Hmm.
just breathing. And
Hmm.
everyone kept saying, well, his birthday was last week and his mom's birthday was yesterday. What's he waiting for? And I'm like, maybe he's not waiting on anything. Like, we're all here. And I just had this feeling like he was just still receiving things. And I kid you not, we all
Yeah.
walked out of the house for like 15 minutes and then he
Hmm.
passed. I
Hmm.
mean, it was like so bizarre.
Oh yeah, yeah. It can be really intense, and the kind of synchronicities that are
Mhm.
generated around a dying person can be just very remarkable.
Certainly. So
Not
let me ask
always,
you,
but yeah, it
sorry, I didn't mean to
definitely.
interrupt.
No, no, you didn't interrupt it. I'm just saying it's not always that way, but it depends on the person and the circumstances. You'll have a dying person like hang on until a relative is flying across the country on a last minute ticket that was I mean that basically happened to my mom, and it was like this friend of hers from Hawaii was like struggling to rent a car, and maybe she was like going, but she just held on to the last minute, and literally 5 minutes after this woman arrived, that was when she finally passed away. And it wasn't for my mom. It's like my mom knew it was important for her
Right,
friend, you see.
right, the closure, right.
Yeah.
So I was gonna ask, when you said that people were sort of coming over to your house to pass, I wondered how much of that was related to your father being initiated into the priesthood and if they were sort of seeking like refuge and consolation from that, or if it was just a convenient location, or do you have any input on that perhaps?
It's tough to say. I think it's a combination of both because, or even other things that are more subtle than that. I think for me, I mean, they were kind of like initiations that I wasn't aware of at the time. My mom, most of them were her relatives coming from her side, and she was a physician herself, so she kind of had that capacity. She wasn't necessarily looking after them, but I think they felt comfortable being under her roof.
Hmm.
And at the time, we had a big enough house where this could take place. Um, but yeah, I mean, I really don't know what other more subtle factors could have been involved in this. But it was definitely a bit traumatic and definitely formative to have like it's like your friends want to hang out and you've got this person who's just dying like downstairs, you know what I mean? And it's not just like one, but it's like
And one
one
after the
goes and
other.
then the next one's in, and then it's like, oh my God. So yeah,
Wow. That's
yeah,
I can't imagine, like you said, how transformative and initiatory that must have been constantly having that death current around.
yeah,
I'm not as familiar, but I've been surrounded by death my whole life as well, and it just it changes your perspective of life.
it does. It does. See, I didn't know what the death current was back then, obviously, but I felt something. And now that I've had more experience with this type of work that we're talking about, it's like, okay, yeah, now I understand what that was.
Mhm. So, what can you tell us about the 5 or 6 years that you spent studying the Orthodox literature and tradition, if you could speak about that?
Well, um, I don't know how much you know about it, but one of the things that's interesting about the Orthodox Church that I think relates to some of what we're going to talk about later is the emphasis on ritual.
Hmm.
And the Orthodox liturgical practice is really a descendant of Neoplatonic theurgy.
It seems
Okay.
that way. Okay.
It really is. It's a combination of a few things. It's kind of like there's been academic research done. A woman named Margaret Barker, she's been quite interesting in this regard. She talks about the liturgy as being strongly related to First Temple Jewish practices.
Okay.
Okay. She's an Anglican theologian, and she spent many decades studying this without ever having gone into an Orthodox church. She studied First Temple practices through primarily text sources, okay, through original writings, Gnostic writings, various Jewish writings, apocryphal writings. pseudo epigraphal writings, on and on. But she's coming at it from a philological, historical angle and so forth. But she says the first time she went into an Orthodox church, and she had already been a scholar for like 20 years, she was blown away because she's like, wow, this is like actual living First Temple practice going on here. Okay.
Living tradition. That's one thing that's so powerful about tradition is it's just a portal right back into the
Yeah.
past.
Yeah. And what is First Temple practice really? I mean, no one knows 100% for sure, but a lot of it has to do with summonings and evocations and stuff like that. Okay. This is before the rabbinical tradition, which is a
Mhm,
much more intellectual, philosophical
mhm,
tradition.
mhm.
Okay. This is more like when the Jewish temple priests were like magicians who could actually conduct like warfare through their practices. Okay. I mean, you've heard of the walls of Jericho, but I mean,
Mhm.
it's that kind
Mhm.
of thing. Okay.
Mhm.
And ancient civilizations engaged in this,
Sure. So
Egyptian.
this was like before they conjured the concept of Kabbalah, essentially, which is like
It's
the more
essentially what
intellectual approach.
Kabbalah encodes, I believe,
Right.
that Kabbalah
Right.
encodes First Temple concepts and practices in a more kind of privatized, like, like under the seat cushion type stuff. Okay. Because you don't have a formal priesthood, and you also don't have a context where this kind of serious energy it's just too much. It's like you, once you're out of that historical time period of like super powerful warlike civilizations, like Babylon, Sumeria, Egypt, and Israel was part of this mix. Once you're in a more civilized context, um, the stuff is kind of out of place, or it needs to be dialed down in a way that it becomes more initiatory. And yeah, the power is still there, but it's not necessarily in that institutionalized level. Now, in the Orthodox Church, it is institutionalized, but it's a little bit different because there's a Christian overlay to it. So the only smiting that occurs is really in the anathema ceremony that's performed once a year, but it's still quite powerful, and it still follows all the standard quote unquote theurgical procedures. Um, so yeah, and that's kind of what I was steeped in. It, they don't teach it as theurgy, they teach it as liturgy. But when you start studying Neoplatonism on your own, then it's like, of course. And the Eastern Church definitely absorbed the Greek philosophical tradition. Okay, the tradition of Plato and the Neoplatonic Plotinus and the Stoics and all of that. And that I would say is kind of a magical, if not theurgical, view of reality. It's certainly a view that's based on powerful correspondences between heaven and earth and the various spiritual planes. So, if you have heard of a work called On the Divine Hierarchies by Dionysius the Areopagite, okay, that is a Christian work of Neoplatonic theurgy. And that's what the Orthodox liturgy is based on. And that text actually is accepted as um, I mean, I think the Catholics have rejected that text as pseudo heretical, but in the Orthodox Church, that text is still venerated.
Interesting. And it's interesting to me that you mention how the orthodoxy goes back to Greek times and Plotinus and Neoplatonism and all that, and how the Greeks were very associated with Egypt and I believe even ruled Egypt for a short amount of time.
For
And they were
sure.
certainly into theurgy and thaumaturgy
Mm-hmm.
and evocation and invocation and ceremony and ritual.
Oh, yeah. If you want to look for Egyptian roots in Orthodox liturgy, you will definitely find them.
Yeah, it's
You
like they
bet.
just keep pulling another mask
Oh,
over it
yeah.
over and over and
Absolutely.
over.
Absolutely. That's what it is. And so, yeah, that darker impulse, or whatever you want to call it, that more primal, maybe that's a better word, that more
Mhm,
primal
mhm,
impulse is filtered, it's shielded, and it's sort of like kind of like a little bit detuned. So it
mhm.
carries a somewhat of a different quality to it. It's more amenable to most people. They're not like jarred into like crazy evolution by it. You know what I mean? They're more like
It's probably a
nourished and
good thing for the
sustained.
most part.
It is. It is. It is. Yeah. So,
And
but that core is still there. It's like the nuclear reactor. Okay, the
yes.
nuclear reactor has to go through the transformer lines until it reaches household current. You know what I mean? So it's that's kind of an analogy.
Sure. I love how you mentioned how the perspective has changed. You really have to try and place yourself in the shoes of the people who are writing these things
Mm-hmm.
to understand. The people who were in the desert who were talking about, the sun. The desert has a totally different perspective of the sun than, say, like Alaska, or like Russia, or some more northern areas. So if you really want to understand the liturgy, you have to understand the perspective of the geography and the time, and what came before that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely.
So what are some of your favorite types of workings currently?
Um, I made kind of a little I don't know what you want to call it, like a little trifecta kind of mnemonic. So
Okay.
I wrote ascension, evocation, and evolution, and those three follow on. They kind of fall under this general concept of alchemy.
Hmm.
So that's
Hmm.
kind of my attitude towards practice, and I see them all three as kind of naturally flowing and sort of cross pollinating one another. So I feel like ascension practices lead to, or they empower your evocation. Okay. And
Hmm.
then evocation also can
Accelerate
trigger,
evolution. Yeah.
accelerate evolution. And then if you want to look at what are all three doing, well, that's the alchemy.
Hmm.
Okay. And so
Hmm.
my notion of alchemy is more like the Taoist idea of internal alchemy, which is
Sure.
sort of like a holistic, biophysiological, but also consciousness incorporated
Mhm.
transformation, if you will.
Sure. Yeah, and I wonder, since there's three, I'm sure one could attribute ascension, evocation, and evolution to Mercury, salt, and sulfur to some
Yeah,
degree.
yeah, yeah.
Very
That
interesting.
that's that that's an interesting point for sure.
Hmm. Very interesting. And I love the Taoist perspective of alchemy as well. It could also perhaps be looked at from a tantric perspective to some degree as well, but
Mm-hmm.
every culture seems to have some wisdom about internal evolution and the subtle processes of consciousness.
For sure.
Hmm. Okay, so what are some of your least favorite types of workings? Either things that you detest, or things that you just don't enjoy doing?
I don't enjoy doing curses.
Okay,
The only time I do them is generally on behalf of other people and people that I'm very close to, or if there's some very direct, um, and very persistent attack. But
sure.
I've noticed as you get more powerful, it's just too scary to do curses on people.
Well,
It
and you
really,
need to do it less often because the things just sort of like just reflect off of you. They kind of just
that's
ricochet.
the next thing I was going to say. That if you're doing your own ascension practice, you're like, well, if they work, you're like one of Elon Musk's rocket ships, whatever. It's just, things just bounce off of it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
generally, I prefer to be in a state where my own work is deflecting or enough to make sure that nothing is sticking to me in that sense.
Sure.
Okay. But sometimes I have found myself in situations where it's like, I'm not doing my practice. I'm in a tired, weakened state, and then there's somebody there, or I'm just put in a situation where I'm surrounded by certain things, and there you go. But I always, I always feel it when it's working because I feel miserable myself, and I know that there are ties. You can't help the fact that you're still connected to everything around you, and so you will feel, and I feel like I don't know. It's just not really in my nature to
Sure.
to to work that way.
Sure. Another way that I like to think about it is as you're developing and you're sort of ascending, it's like you're raising an octave. And it's like if somebody's obsessed with cursing people all the time, they're on a different octave than you
You,
probably. So their spells are like missing you because you're up here and they're down here is another.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Interesting. So, how has magic changed your life for the better? You've already mentioned several ways. Was there anything else that you wanted to sort of add to that?
Let's see what I scribbled down here. Well, I mean, it's changed my life in a lot of ways because I've kind of got like a tinkering research style personality. So a lot of this, to tell you the truth, was kind of fueled by curiosity as well. Just wanting to see like what what is out there. Stuff like that. And I think what I found is it's kind of two things have happened. One, it is, I guess what I wrote here. Let me see. Oh, I said something in terms of what has happened and what hasn't happened. Okay, so in other words, things maybe that I was expecting have not happened, and certain things that I wasn't expecting have happened, if that makes sense. And
Mhm.
so having my preconceptions radically rearranged as a result of this work has been extremely eye-opening to
Sure.
say the least. And so I think just that level of not only expanded but kind of continuously expanding consciousness that comes as a result of this work is truly wild. I mean, it is like riding a tidal wave. And it's like the wave just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And it's like, don't look down. Don't look down. You know what I mean? And it's just like, wow, where is this going to end? And so it's I think that that radical shift and it's been and having it take place in the context of a world that seems almost rigid in its mundane structures. Okay, and yet somehow there is this energy that is either available or running through things or inside part of us or all of the above or whatnot, and that there are things out there, there are methods, there are ways of working with it that can deliver, maybe not deliver in the way a comic book or such,
Mhm.
but even so, you realize that even in these comic book or folk descriptions, that there are serious grains of truth in
Mhm.
them. You just have to kind of read between the accumulated, you know,
Mhm.
detritus or what have you, or read between the lines, and you realize that there isn't really that much exaggeration about what's possible. Maybe I can't actualize some of the wilder stuff, but I've already seen stuff that is like, whoa, wait a minute, this is just ridiculous.
Mhm.
So, and I realized probably historically, I mean, modern day practitioners are probably on a very low level compared to what people were capable of doing way back when there was no TV and the discipline was extremely harsh. I can only imagine what people were experiencing.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. I mean, I look at the type of content that most people are absorbed in these days, and I mean, look at YouTube. My channel won't even get promoted unless I release a 30 to 60-second video once a week. They actually told me that in my like user settings in the YouTube studio. Like, if you want us to promote your channel, more or less, you need to release one short per week. And I'm just like, where's this headed? You know, I can't imagine whenever people's attention span is too short to even watch a 30-second video 20, 30 years from now.
Yeah,
So I think there's probably a lot of truth to that speculation that people were more powerful because I think discipline is a direct token or a conduit to how much power you can control and invoke and process.
definitely.
So yeah. I always like to read like myths and legends too, because even if that stuff isn't true, I mean, it can be used metaphorically. It can be used inspirationally.
Definitely. definitely. I you take the stereotype of the sorcerer as he appears in so many different genres, and I mean, it's everywhere. Whatever culture you look at, the sorcerer emerges as this figure. Fascinating, revolting, terrifying, but also one of the most ancient archetypes that human beings have come up with. So it's like, hey, there's really something there. And so I kind of got hooked onto this archetype at an early age, and I became very curious about it. Rasputin is the classic
Sure.
orthodox practitioner turned left-hand path, and so he kind of stands in the background as a kind of a material witness for Russian sorcery in general. Okay, and you cannot deny the power that's coming off that guy.
Yeah,
I
there
don't
was
care.
more than one miracle attributed to him. Even
Oh
his
yeah.
death is
Oh yeah.
somewhat miraculous.
Oh yeah. He was impossible to kill. He floated 2 miles down a freezing river. He was attacked with a pickaxe. He was shot with like silver bullets. I mean, it was ridiculous.
Man, yeah, certainly the sorcerer has always been my favorite archetype. I could take or leave the warrior, big, strong guy. Merlin has always been, ever since I was a kid. Merlin was like,
Yeah.
because my grandpa was he was a ceremonial magician, but I didn't know that until later when I started practicing myself and I could recognize the signs. But he was an illusionist, and
Oh,
he would
okay.
always bend my reality with these, stage illusions. And so to me, like Merlin was like my grandpa's grandpa, you know.
Yeah,
And I actually come from Welsh and Scottish heritage, so now that I think about that, that makes a lot of sense.
that
Anyway,
does.
so what are some other areas that you draw inspiration from?
So like I said, okay, so I mentioned kind of the folk tales and the fairy tales, and being Russian, like Baba Yaga is a huge thing, and she has a male counterpart, Cachet the Deathless, okay, who is the classic necromancer slash sorcerer. So he was huge. Um,
Okay.
and let's see. So yeah, as I got older, I kind of just went all over the place. I studied different religions. Philosophy. Nietzsche was actually quite interesting and inspirational for certain alchemical transformations along this type of path. Poetry, Eastern religions, Tantra, Tibetan Buddhism, Carlos Castaneda, actually. There's
Sure.
things in there that are quite useful.
Sure.
Uh, let's see what else. Yeah, just stuff of that sort. I mean,
Yeah.
Grant Morrison, Alan Moore, what's that latest show that's actually has a lot of esoteric material? Doom Patrol. Have
I
you
haven't
have
heard of
you
it.
watched it?
Uh-uh.
Yeah,
I'm,
take a
I'm gonna
look
make a
at it.
note. I'll make a note of that.
Yeah, yeah,
Doom Patrol.
yeah. Magicians is quite good too.
Okay. Is that the TV series, The Magicians?
Yeah, TV series, Doom Patrol. Yeah,
Okay. All right. And you mentioned Nietzsche. I love I always somehow end up in this discussion about people bringing up and citing Nietzsche as far as like materialism and intellectualism goes. And I'm like, have you ever read Thus Spoke Zarathustra? That's a path
exactly.
working.
It is.
I mean, from
Absolutely.
from my perspective, it seems like from your
Oh,
perspective,
absolutely. Yeah. Nietzsche's only useful for the deeper alchemical stuff, the real deep personal adversarial alchemy.
love it.
And yeah, you can read him and start your own like Nazi flag waving cult, but that's
Sure.
nonsense. Okay. That's
And I
that's
think,
not
yeah.
that's not even exoteric. That's just like hopeless as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think a lot of Nietzsche and Jung, for that matter, goes over a lot of. I certainly most of it goes over my head, but I think I have at least a tenuous grasp on a little bit from a symbolic standpoint. I've always loved symbolism. Have studied symbolism heavily ever since I was a teenager, and I love Nietzsche and Jung and Castaneda for
Mm-hmm,
those reasons.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, so when you think about your practice as a whole, what do you see as some of your strengths?
Um, I think one of my strengths is getting sort of like intriguing pieces of gnosis that kind of shed light on deeper structures of the Qliphoth, or specifically what I'm working for. Or one of the things in magic is like finding tighter pathways to kind of
Mhm.
really get the kind of experience or understanding or results that you're looking for, because you can
Yeah.
generalize and then you can create that tighter funnel effect.
Yeah.
So things of that sort, like how to use lesser spirits to get bigger results. Okay.
Mhm.
So this combination, how do you use larger forces and how to use smaller forces and how to use so that's part of the alchemy, how to combine various forces to get what you're looking for, and how to create these. It's so whether you want to call it, cooking, Klipothic, cooking, or whether you want to call it alchemy or whatever. I mean, it has a lot to do with that, is understanding how to combine the greater with the lesser, and
Mhm.
the different polarities, the positive with the negative, or the different planetary energies with whatever, you know what I mean? That kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Mhm.
So a lot of what I think I'm pretty good at is getting little insights into what particular spirits or energies might be good for really fine tuning or tweaking certain results. And then I often get really big, unexpected. Um, it's like connecting a circuit. It's like I get some good generalized energy, and then all of a sudden, boom, like
Lightning
something
bolt.
really specific will come
Mhm.
through. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. And then that gnosis just goes in there, and it's like, wow, it changes your whole understanding of the craft and the level that you're at and all of that. So that's kind of, and I, um, I end up recombining a lot of other people's work. That's kind of how I work.
Same.
I do subtle rewordings of what other people have done, or I take their rituals and I will take one from one ritual, one from another ritual. I will take an opening from here, or an ending from there, or a hymn from here, and I'll change some of the wording, or I'll recombine it in certain ways to kind of get what I'm looking for. I'm not one of those people who channels a lot of like completely original material. I'm not cranking out, and I'm very thankful that there are people who do that, because obviously I benefit from their work, but I'm not cranking out like super original, languages and sigils and blah blah blah. So I'm not doing too much. I've done some of that, but most of my um, work is focused on, like I said, sort of my personal ascension practices and my personal alchemical practices and so forth. And so a lot of that is done by recombining and subtly rewording the work of other people. And
Mhm.
of course, just research in general.
Mhm. I think it's very important to do that, that it grows your influence and it grows your sort of syncretic ability to create amalgams from various components alchemically. That's something that that's sort of how I started writing my own ceremonies and rituals by taking, a lot of other people's stuff and then turning it into one thing and then extracting greater truths out of it and then sort of translating that, finding something like a formula and then projecting my own consciousness into that formula.
That's, oh wow, okay, that was excellent, because that basically in a nutshell is what I've ended up doing myself.
Excellent. I think
Yeah.
that's important to do. I think that's the sign of someone who is invested and interested and has their own inner drive sort of, going.
And I've also realized, like, you are the work. So it's like whatever
Yes.
strengths and weaknesses you have, that's what you've got to work with. And you're going to get more traction by understanding and working with your strengths and your weaknesses than you will be trying to do what somebody else is doing. That's been a huge truth for me to realize, because I'm not super crafty. I don't draw like mind blowing sigils and this, that, and I don't channel crazy demonic languages like some people do, or I'm not great with a router. So I'm not building these awesome looking altars, you know? But it's like, when I just engage at my own skill level, that's when the wheels really start turning. So
Mhm.
I think that's what I would recommend too for anyone listening to this, that no matter where you are, actually embrace that, embrace your weaknesses, because actually those weaknesses are going to be pivotal, because those weaknesses will force you to really find that gnosis, because it's going to be your attempt to work with your weaknesses that will open up those powerful, because you'll find a way to get what you need despite quote unquote your capacity, or what you might feel is a lack of capacity.
Yeah, man's reach exceeds his grasp. um, So yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely wonderful. There's something about working through your own inner struggles, because 9 times out of 10, somebody else is struggling with that as well. That's one thing that I realized over the last few years is every single piece of trauma that I've been through, all of this hard work I've had to do, I can now help an infinite number of people with those same issues, those same situations, those same problems.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Mm-hmm.
just such a magical thing. And I often say perhaps that's one reason why bad things happen to good people, is because those people are willing to transmute that trauma and that injury and then heal other people with it.
Well, there's the evolutionary acceleration aspect
Mm.
that we haven't touched on yet, but I think it's looming in the background. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I can sort of hear it clicking.
Yeah.
So, so we can address that now if you like.
Well, I mean, I think, I mean, one of your questions was kind of like, what is your take on the Klipoth or Klipothic work in general?
Mhm.
And this is a can of worms, I think, in a lot of ways, because it's a different thing for so many different people, and it's a controversial thing, but at the same time, I think it's kind of becoming a trendy thing, and all sorts of things are getting lost in the process.
Mhm.
So I mean, I can only tell you just a brief sort of description of my sense of it. Um, addressing some of these ideas that people have. Oh, you're working with like evil. This is like the purest evil. This is the evilest of the evil. Like what benefit or what good could possibly come from working with something so supposedly intrinsically evil? And I think this is kind of like, the thing that people don't really want to address. So
Absolutely.
I will just give you my take on it, and again, this is just a partial take, but I think one of the big things here is this earlier idea of ascension, evocation, and evolution, or what I
Mhm.
would call accelerated evolution. I kind of had this metaphor that I wanted to use. Well, what is the cliff off? Well, I wanted to say it's kind of like a cross between a spear point and a live grenade.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And so there's that sharp penetrating quality, and then there's that explosive, almost chaotic quality to it. Okay.
Absolutely.
You see what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
it's something,
Yeah.
yeah, it's weird, but it's one of those things that I think it's not that easy, I think, for most people to understand like what they're actually dealing with. But if you keep that image in mind, that will explain so many things about it, and it will explain so many experiences that you have with this kind of work. Okay, the crazy shit that starts happening around you that just is like, what the F? Okay,
Mhm.
I mean, I could
Yeah.
go on and on, and you know that you're the epicenter of it, but you don't
Sure.
say a word, because two things can happen: people will misunderstand, and it may not be good for them to hear that kind of information.
Mhm.
Okay, so that kind of addresses one of your other questions. It's like, what is your experience with this work? Well, it can be isolating because of that aspect. There's
You're
a
telling me.
hermetic, yeah, there's a hermetic quality where it's like you do have this nuclear reactor going off inside of you, but you really can't say anything to anyone about it. Okay. And and that reactor also, it's again, I hate to bring up Musk's stupid rocket ship, but when that thing went off, how it burned out the launch pad and it damaged civilian infrastructure.
Hmm.
Okay. And that's kind of also what these cliffothic workings can do because they accelerate evolution. They can
Hmm.
also accelerate evolution around you. And it can look like people are having meltdowns,
Hmm.
breakdowns, crazy. If I just mentioned to you what has taken place around me in the last 2 weeks, it boggles belief. So this is the way I understand it, that if you're doing powerful work, it can have a kind of tornado like effect, and
Or calcinatory. Yeah.
it can cause other people who may not be ready to evolve or want to evolve, and it can bring things in their life to the surface that may
Hmm.
be perceived as chaos or upsetting, okay, or
Hmm.
chaotic or what have you. So I've definitely seen that effect. And but I don't attribute that to evil as such. And the reason I say that is because the way I view this is I believe the clip-off is an essential structure within us.
Hmm.
What Jung called the shadow,
Hmm.
um, or what the medieval people called the satanic, I believe that that actually exists in us. There's a real powerful, dark, shadowy, primordial prima materia in us, dark matter, whatever you want to call it. And that is basically what you're working with when you're doing glyphothic um, sorcery or goetic work or what have you. And it is interesting because that work, even though it seems really dark, it actually crystallizes a kind of evolution that then spills over into your surroundings and to the rest of your life. And you become kind of that spear point, for better or
Hmm.
for worse.
Hmm.
But it's not negative, it's just overwhelmingly powerful. It's the
Hmm.
same way a tornado or a hurricane is not negative, it's primal, it's primordial. Um, but at the same time, it is part of the ecosystem. It's part of the natural cycle. And without this energy, things do get stagnant.
Hmm.
Okay. And without this energy, things don't move and new paradigms do not get fostered. You see, so I think glyphosate work is extremely powerful when it comes to new paradigms,
Hmm.
personally, alchemically, but also aeonically, if you will, in terms of world history. I don't mean anything in a megalomaniacal sense, but I simply mean um, just generating a kind of force that breaks through stagnant barriers, whether they're ideological or whether they're political or whether they're world historical, to break through to fresher, cleaner, newer, more complex concepts that are there. But until we break through all that stagnant energy or whatever, then we can't we can't get access to them. So, and I think we live right now in one of these very stagnant time periods. And so, to some extent, this clipothic energy, yes, it's destructive, but at the same time, it's also making room for new energies to kind of be available.
Hmm. Yeah, the way that you explain it as a spear point with a grenade, I've never heard anyone else talk about it that way. The and I say that because I think of it that way as well. The way that I've always thought about it is like a grenade that causes a flame. There's that initial concussive,
Yeah,
expansive expansion, expanding force, but then there's the flame that's left behind that is still burning, so to
yeah,
speak. And what you mentioned about it being a pool of potential, essentially, to sort of paraphrase what you said, I agree with. And I always, when people ask me why I work with these forces, I always cite two sources, Jung and Dante. Jung said that a tree's branches can't grow to heaven unless its roots grow to hell. And Dante said the path to paradise begins in Inferno.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And when you work at the root level of the tree, you're affecting
Yes,
everything that's above the ground.
exactly. Very well said. Excellent. And so do you have any experience with the tunnels or the negative paths that connect the cliff off? Or that might be a more new era thing, but do you have any experience with the tunnels or the
I
cavern?
do have some experience with the tunnels. I sometimes experience them as a more subtle after effect of various workings, and some workings can bring you into closer contact with the energies of the tunnel. And some tunnels, depending on where you are in your work, some tunnels will be more active than others. Like right
Mhm.
now, the tunnel that's very active for me is the one between Satariel and Gagiel. Okay.
Okay. Interesting.
Okay. So that tunnel has been extremely active for me in my current work right now. But it's taken me a while to get there. It's taken me a lot of, and I'm not one of those people that goes up the tree in some crazy, super linear, organized manner.
Mhm.
I tend to be more jumping along different paths and lines and spheres, depending on. It's sometimes there's usually there's some reason behind it, whether it's intuitive, and sometimes the reason is a little more organized or planned, or sometimes it's just whatever. But usually it ends up being more interesting for me that way. And sometimes, like I said, for me, intuition also is a big factor in this work. Is refining your intuition is one of the most profound ways you progress on this path, is learning to differentiate these subtle signals that come from whatever phase of the work that you're involved in. And so yeah, and I can feel like, so when you're up there in those higher tunnels, you definitely feel them as incredible pressurization. Okay. Yeah.
I think about like they get more and more
Yeah.
narrow and less
Oh
as
yeah.
you can fit through.
Oh yeah. And so that nuclear radioactive quality is just, it's like the dial on the course, like it's hitting the red.
Yeah, yeah, the steam's leaving the tea kettle.
It is, especially when you learn how to connect Satariel to Gagiel, and that's when the stuff really starts to flow. Okay, but you can't do that unless you've had certain formative experiences on the middle pillar as well.
Mhm.
Okay,
Mhm.
so it all works together. You have to understand the essential alchemical content of the right and the left hand pillar, and also what the content of the middle pillar is as well. And and,
Mhm.
and if you start to understand those, then you can connect Satariel to Gagiel. And once you do that, that's when really interesting stuff starts to happen, because that's when Doth starts to activate.
That's
Okay.
really interesting. For me, it was the path from Tagirion to Satariel, Zamradiel, and that's actually why my
Okay.
channel logo is the
Okay.
glyph for
Yes.
Zamradiel.
Yes. I noticed that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Very,
Yeah.
very close paths as well.
Yeah. And so you find that your own personal daemon will actually manifest along a particular path that's unique to your
Mhm.
physis. Do, do,
Mhm.
do, do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, yes,
Like each
absolutely.
one of us magicians is related to a particular path and a particular alchemical combination. So no two are the same.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Excellent. That is exactly what I was wanting to talk about. That is,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what you mentioned about the more subtle nature, I find, at least in my experience, that the Cliffoth tend to manifest in a very objective manner, and the tunnels tend to manifest in a very subjective manner. And I'm not sure if that is congruent with your experience or.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I almost feel like it sometimes kind of fluctuates, that
Interesting.
that depending on what stage you're working at, sometimes the energy of the tunnel will be more powerful, and sometimes the energy of the sphere will be more powerful. And when you connect certain spheres, it's hard to say exactly what role is any of these are playing, because obviously to do these connections, everything kind of has to be working on some level, just some aspects are more active than others. Um, so for any sphere to be active, it depends on previous work that was done to
Yeah.
energize them. If
Mhm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That at least
That's
that's
been my
that.
experience as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can make numerous, or if not endless, passes through the whole system, and each time you do that, you ramp up your power, your gnosis, your understanding, and all of that. But then you need to be careful to ground all of that and alchemically transform it, because there are potentially negative side effects
Hmm.
to this kind of work,
Hmm.
which I mean, people don't talk about them too much, but I think the most obvious thing is like you have too much power or energy running through you, and if you're not able to assimilate it or ground it, you can kind of you know be, whether you're kind of off your game, or you're getting a little obsessional, or you're getting too sort of megalomaniacal, and you have to like figure out like, okay, we've got to ground this, and we've got to understand that there's a difference between what I'm doing on the astral and who I think I am versus what I'm doing here. Okay.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting relationship between those two things, like who I am as a person and what I'm evoking or what I'm invoking, and how they're interacting with one another, and how I'm processing those energies within my physical and energetic bodies. All of that
Absolutely.
is quite important, you
I
know.
find that process of synthesis is crucial. I I've been I sort of study psychology in my free time, and I can't help but attribute most mental illnesses to the Clifoth, schizophrenia and Talmael, for instance. I mean, there's just certain aspects of our consciousness that to me are just in my life really they just have a direct pull on my attention, and I can't help but attribute certain things to them. So definitely there are negative aspects to this work. There can be. And anytime you're messing with chaotic energy like this, which is also something that you mentioned that was interesting to me, that you sort of jump around. To me, that sort of suits the more chaotic nature of this side of existence anyway.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, definitely. And oh shoot, it slipped my mind. Maybe I'll
It happens.
remember what else I was going to say, because I think there was some talk of there's like a tunnel that's got like the leapers associated with it, and so
Hmm.
it's part of the, maybe it was from Kenneth Grant or something like that, where he talks about like the leaping toads of the cliff off,
Hmm.
and so there is that sense of like something like that, or that kind of sense that you're leaping along this sort of like cosmic roadmap of chaos, or what, something along those lines. But it's interesting how many people do, they get drawn into this work, they get attracted to this work, and then they end up having losing their minds, or going crazy, or killing someone, or hurting someone. I mean, it is ridiculous, and it's like, yeah, it's that's the thing with this work, is the misconceptions, and also, misconceptions about like, oh yeah, no, this is just a lark, like anybody can just start playing around with this stuff, and it's just fun and games, right? Or there's people who are like, oh yeah, I'm going to be darker than thou, and they start getting drunk on this dark energy, but they don't do any other work. Okay.
Exactly.
They
Exactly.
don't examine themselves. they
Hmm.
they realize, see, what the cliff off does is it takes away all of your safety nets. So
Sure.
it's like, if you want to be a good person and do cliffothic work, then that's up to you. You have to create that for yourself.
Hmm.
And if you want to go crazy and be as super dark as you possibly can, good luck with that. Okay, because that's like, it's like, um it that's why I emphasize evolution. This work is ideally approached when there's some kind of concept of evolution, or you're going to be, it's like, look, we have electricity in our homes. Well, we don't stick forks into the outlets, right?
Sure.
Why would we do that? I mean, maybe when we were 19, 17, oh, that might be fun. Oh, put one between your teeth. Okay, fine, you did it once. but why would you do that in your 30s? You know,
Right.
it
Yeah.
doesn't make sense. So what I'm about is promoting a constructive approach to this
Mhm.
kind of work. The problem is how do you make this kind of, this thing's already, this kind of work already isn't that palatable in general because of all of its trappings. And even in the occult world, this is considered kind of like dangerous or
Mhm.
specious or malignant at best. And so even there, you will run into people who kind of like take a step back when they hear the kind of stuff that you're involved in. And I think the more professional, academic, Jungian world is also very skeptical of this sort of stuff, if they've even heard of it. And they're like, oh no, how could this possibly be beneficial? You know?
Uh-huh.
And so I think there's just a tiny percentile of people like us who are like, I hate to use the word trailblazers, but I mean, that just ends up being a de facto reality, for
Mm.
better or for worse, and whatever motivated us to step onto this path. I think for people like us, it was just, there was really nothing else that was really quite cutting it. And it's kind of like you just ended up here because everything led to this.
Mm.
And this, and I actually think the cliff auth is just a gate to something else. It's just a structure. It's not the end in itself. Okay. All the stuff is really on the other side of it. But
It
this is
seems that
just,
way. Hmm.
this is more like one of those security pads where you have to type
Yeah,
in the, okay.
sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And that's basically what we're working at. But I think there's stuff that's considerably more um, uncharted, if you will, that is even beyond the structure of the cliff off. And the
Mm.
cliff off is serving to channel and control, and even to some extent to detune some of those energies. And we're benefiting from that. We're benefiting from a structure that magicians and kabbalists and sorcerers have created.
Mhm.
Um, this is something that's been passed down, and this is a way of begin. It's like a ladder, okay? You
Yes.
know, a ladder helps you get from the ground to the roof. So it's but once you're on the roof, there's other things that go up from there. So that's kind of what we're working with. We're working with a kind of hypercube or a magical superstructure, whatever you want to call it. That's the way I see it, and it's necessary because there is, even though it's the cliff off, there's still safety built into it.
Sure.
And I think that as humans, we need some kind of scaffolding. We need some coherent way to access the darker, primordial, chaotic nature of consciousness, the
Especially
shadow.
if you want, especially if you want to translate it back to your fellow person.
That's
There
right.
needs to be some sort of tangible, coherent function or pattern to it.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's basic. I think we're basically using a kind of technology, if you will, that's
Mm.
been passed on.
Mhm.
And it's still got gasoline in the engine for people that want to explore it. I know too many analogies, but
Yeah.
it's that's kind of over the years. That's how I've um, begun to understand how this all works. Um,
That's excellent. That is precisely what I was looking for. Thank you very much. That
uh-huh,
I would love to discuss this perhaps maybe in our own free time a little bit
sure,
more. We
sure.
might be going way over people's heads, but I mean, if you're on the channel called Cliffoth Quest, I mean, hopefully you're at least
Right.
interested in this.
Yeah, exactly.
So, what are some entities that you have worked with, possibly Cliffothic entities or possibly other entities that you feel have sort of propelled your journey forward?
I would say for me, probably the most influential entity has been Lucifuge Rofocale.
Excellent. Okay.
Okay. He appeared at a very early stage before I really even understood what I was getting into. And he still
Okay.
showed me stuff at a very early stage years ago that I still haven't quite deciphered. Okay, so he showed me something in the beginning that's still something that I have yet to get to and to really understand.
It would be him as well to
Yeah,
do something like that. He has been he they it has been one of the more influential entities for me as well, and also one of the more intriguing. I find, as a lot of people do find, entities sort of manifest um, symbolically about lessons or energies that they have to teach about. And the first
yeah,
time I saw Lucifuge, he appeared to me as a hooded skeleton with three tongues.
uh-huh.
And I'm like, Lord of Flies, King of Lies.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, he's the king of lies to me. And so the fact that he had three tongues, I was just like, wow,
That's
how
so funny. The
symbolic.
three is very significant with him, but I
Satariel.
don't see three
Yeah.
tongues. I see the three horns. Okay.
Interesting.
That's usually what
Interesting.
I ended up seeing with him. But he's taken a
So
number of different shapes and even different colors from my in my experience.
that's very
He has different
interesting.
moods, almost like a chameleon. You know how chameleons change their color depending on their mood. So he's
Well, he
kind of
is
has
maybe the concealer.
what's that?
The concealers deal
Yes,
with
yes,
Satariel, so it makes sense that he would be
yes,
chameleon-like.
yes, yes. But he's kind of been like when I get lost on the tree, like which happens a lot. Um,
Yes.
and he is by far the most helpful entity to go to straighten out all the confused, knotted shit and energy that I've concocted for myself. Okay, get rid of that, get rid of that. No, no, not yet. No, not this. Okay. And it's like, boom, simplify.
Yeah.
And so he has really helped me to simplify my practice, to make it very streamlined, very bare bones. And I've
Hmm.
noticed that the power has dramatically increased as a result of that. And he's really about quality rather than quantity.
Hmm.
Whether it's in terms of like entities that he suggests or possible ritual things that he might be suggesting, everything that he said, it may look kind of like, oh, that's too simple, or that's no. Every time I've really followed that advice, it has had seriously profound results. So yeah, that's been something that's been, and I've had lots of quote unquote profound experiences in other spheres, but I would say pretty much all of them, I can feel his energy mediating them on some level, and some have been very
Yeah.
directly mediated through him.
Yeah. I think I know what you mean. And now that you mention that, that's sort of like that was almost like an intimation that I had, but I didn't really know how to express it. I'm glad that you said that because I definitely recognize that now that you mention it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. And the three thing is interesting too. I He doesn't manifest with three horns to me, but he has like a third socket for like a third eye, so three
Yeah.
eyes and three tongues.
Yeah. Exactly.
Very, very interesting. So man, so the way that you also mentioned how he just sort of strips away and just leaves the bare bones, that was really symbolic as he manifested as a skeleton to me. It was just
Mm-hmm.
like, what do
Mm-hmm.
you actually need to continue this? Yeah,
Yeah.
you've got all this and yeah, you've got all that, but it's holding you back and it's weighing you down from your ascension.
Yeah. Yeah. And he also lets you stew in your own juices. I've noticed that.
Hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Until you kind of finally just face the realization, or your thinking finally moves in that constructive direction, and it's the one that you didn't want to go down. You wanted something different, something flashier, something, you know what I mean? Just, but, and that's the evolution. That's the direction kind of real insight as opposed to fake insight, if you will.
Right.
And that's a really tough battle. It's actually the humbling side of this. And a lot of people get into this and they don't want to be humbled. They want to be exalted. Oh, I'm
Hmm.
going to be a god, I'm going to be deified and all that. And yeah, there is plenty of stuff like that, but at the same time, you got to focus on the other things too, the softer things as well, the yin and the yang.
Hmm.
Um it's important because that's how you balance and alchemically are able to contain this energy by working with the hard and the soft. Uh, you
Absolutely.
can't you can't just be jacking yourself with this super destructive energy at all times. I know people get addicted to it. I've
I
gotten
try to
addicted
tell
to it.
people they don't want to hear
Yeah,
it. There's
yeah,
so much more to this than power.
yeah, exactly.
So, what was it? See if I could rewind here. Um, anyway, um, yeah, oh, I remember now. You were talking about how it's always where you don't want it to be. I find so often that growth is right at the edge of our comfort zone.
Mhm.
And so much of this path is about being willing to seek that adversity and to
Yeah,
become more than you are.
yeah. So that's another thing relating back to Lucifuge. So I've experienced Lucifuge as in his blue, dark blue, intellectual, meditative, philosophical aspects, where he really is like the quintessential librarian. But I've also experienced him in a red, fiery, um, blacksmithing kind of quality. So he's kind of shown me the Satariel kind of has a forge, is like a forge, and he's also has an aspect as a smith. Okay.
That's really interesting because it's almost like a prerequisite to Asmodeus, that
Yeah.
red
Oh
fiery
yeah,
energy.
because Golakab is just a weaker emanation of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep, I would agree
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
And it's the forge of Satariel that's necessary for the higher alchemies.
Hmm.
Okay. And
Yes.
only when you've become forged to a certain level, then Gagiel starts to open up.
Hmm.
Okay. Because Belial requires a weapon. Okay. And essentially, that's what I'm relating to as far as the forging and the spear point. So you can connect the dots, I think, from there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
Okay.
it's the narrow spear that works its way through the rib to the heart.
Right, right, right. So that's why Lucifuge, I would say Satariel is probably for the beginner and for even the intermediate person, and even for the advanced person, Satariel is probably the key cliffa on the entire tree. Okay. That
Mm,
the influence and power that it has over all the other ones is so profound, and it's such a gatekeeper for anything that you do down below, and it's the gate to the supernals.
mm,
Okay, so it
yes.
is huge, and if you don't properly um, evolve into Satariel, then you kind of get closed off from the deeper and more dynamic openings that the tree is capable of.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. If not Satariel, then maybe Thagirion. But I definitely agree that Satariel is sort of the gate above and below.
yeah,
I don't
it
know
is.
how.
It is. Oh
Yeah.
no, you absolutely need Thagirion. Thagirion is the inner work,
Mhm.
and you can't access the higher. Like I needed to have a fairly serious Thagirion transformation before the deeper levels of Satariel became accessible, for sure. But that still shows that Satariel is still,
Yeah.
the gate,
Uh-huh.
and that's actually the path that you're referring to,
Hmm.
which is
Yeah.
your logo there. Yeah.
It was an
So yeah,
interesting. That was the path I spent the longest in. This is a dance that I've been doing. I go up and down the tree and
yeah,
up and down the tree because I found that, like they say, you can't step in the same river twice or you
yeah.
can never go back home. So I'm just on this infinite like journey, up
Uh-huh.
and down and up and down.
Yeah, yeah. That's how it is.
Hmm.
But it's never the same. I mean, it's
It's
always
never the same.
completely, I mean, it's just ridiculous how many, just endless layers.
Yeah, and I've often wondered, like in Kabbalah, they talk about like the four worlds of like Atzia and Yetzirah and Bria and Asya. Like I've been applying that theory to the Qliphoth and to the Sephiroth as well. So I'm
Mhm,
like
mhm.
working my way up and down, and I wonder how much of the change is due to that. I wonder how much of the change is due to just the chaotic nature of evolution and transformation.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a puzzle. It's a mystery.
Well, one of the things I think we've touched on, but maybe we haven't talked about it so much is the shadow.
Mm,
And
mhm,
and I think, I don't know if what I'm going to say is really going to be that clear, because this is a concept that I'm still working out for myself. But I just think that the shadow, or what Jung talked about as the shadow, I think that's kind of like the tip of the iceberg, and I think that this shadow is something that connects us to, um, whether you want to call it the multiverse, or energy prior to matter, or dark matter, or wormholes, or alternate dimensions, whatever you want to call it. But there is this part of us, and it's not just what people talk about as consciousness, but it's this darker side of consciousness. If you took out, there's a lot of darkness even in our universe.
mhm,
Stars are like little pinpricks in a field of darkness. Okay, you see, and so this is the cliff off that's kind of reflected in our cosmos, and we're missing a whole side of our being that we've been kind of sealed off from, or bifurcated from, and it's been considered taboo to chip away at that barrier that's been set up, whether it's by religion, or whether it's by the old gods, or what have you. But really, this is what, to me, the Cliffoth really represents, is all of that dark, um, matter shaping, reality shaping, quantum type stuff, that not only are we all connected to, but it represents actually a significant portion of what we are. And the role that it plays in our history and in our evolution is unfathomable. The problem is that role is unconscious. So
mhm.
actually, I would actually say that, rather than calling this the shadow, I would actually say that what Jung called the unconscious, that's
Yeah,
actually the cliff off. The
I think so
whole
too.
thing
I
is
think so.
the cliff off. Not just the shadow as a kind of manifestation of an aspect of the unconscious, but no, I would say that the entire unconscious is what the cliff off represents, and the energies that it represents. And so Jung already made this, he was already seriously considering the idea that not only is the unconscious collective, that it includes, um, human history, and whether you want to call it genetic memory, or whether you want to call it, um, morphic resonances, or what have you. But I actually think it includes cosmic history as well.
Hmm. I do too. I do too.
Okay, and so that's basically what you're tapping into in
Mhm.
in an attenuated form. But nonetheless, even through the cliff off, which is highly attenuated, it's still a lot more than what most people consciously experience. And so it can be, that's why people have meltdowns, because this energy is extremely powerful. It's formative. There's certain, I don't know if you've heard of a 16th 17th century theosopher, theologian, Jacob Boehme. Okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay, so he kind of wrote about what he called the wrath of God, or the
Hmm.
wrathful side of God. Okay, the blind, if you will, primordial, pure, energetic essence of God. And that's kind of what you're dealing with here. You're kind of like falling into God's shadow, and that's to some extent what you're working with here.
That is, yeah, that completely resonates with me. I think about it like the force behind the form. If
Yeah,
existence is the form, I think about things in force and form, almost like Hokmah and Binah. If Hokmah is the unstoppable force, Binah is the immovable object. The Qliphoth might be anti-existence. It might be, and maybe not anti-matter, but like I said, the force behind the form,
yeah,
perhaps.
yeah, exactly. It's like the cosmic ocean, and then the
Yes.
Sephiroth is just the island that appears in the middle of that ocean.
Well said. Yeah.
You know?
Well said. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, and I love the analogy of the stars in the night sky too, because the stars in themselves are massive. They're ginormous, but they're just pale in comparison to the space between. And
Exactly.
the metaphor of what that represents. Because I mean,
Exactly.
even within an atom, there is what, like 98%, 99% so-called negative space.
That's right.
But there's a force there
That's right. So
behind that force.
that's exactly what we're dealing with is that negative space.
Definitely seems that way to me.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I've been waiting to have this conversation with somebody for such a long time. I'm so thankful for this
Oh,
opportunity. Thank you.
likewise, likewise. Thank you. I've learned a lot from your channel, from watching your ritual work. I've definitely picked up on some great things. Actually, your couple things, just to point them out specifically. One thing, what you said about goetic demons being very etheric and clefothic entities being more astral. That
Mhm.
to me resonated a lot, and I thought, wow, that's a great way to tune your workings, is to begin with a goetic invocation, to kind of start working the etheric layers first,
Yes.
okay, and to begin that separation process from mundane reality. Okay, so that was a very good and you know, Azazel is one of your entities, and I was never that aware of him, but now he's like super prevalent, and now I've like experienced multiple forms of his that have been like, whoa, that is some serious gnosis. And I would say that that little mantra of yours has been very helpful in that regard as well. Okay,
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. I
so
attribute
I've
that
even,
to Azazel.
I don't know if that resonates with you, but I even got this little thing where like different pronunciations of his name actually equate to quite different forms that he can
Yes.
manifest. Okay.
Absolutely.
And so I
Hmm.
have three forms that I was able to discern, and very different from one another. Um, but yeah, I don't know if I want to say too much more than that, but I will say
That's
that
okay.
it was extremely helpful listening to your, or just watching you do your thing.
I really appreciate that. Is the main reason that I wanted to do all of this is to inspire other people and to share something that I couldn't find. I
Yeah,
looked and I
yeah,
looked and I looked for something like this and I couldn't find it. And something in me was just, and it might have been Azazel, I don't know. Just,
yeah,
I mean, it was like I was on a leash almost.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
just, until I started moving that way, it was like I was
yeah,
being dragged. And
yeah,
now I just feel like I'm floating in this ocean of gnosis and opportunity.
yeah. Well, you know what? I will drop this little bit then, because what I see, the literature portrays Azazel as like the goat and the goat
Mhm.
god and and it's like, yeah, yeah, there is that. But
Mhm.
through what you were doing, I actually was able, I got a different gnosis of um, a very powerful entity that can actually see across multiple dimensions
Mhm.
um, simultaneously, and that is a powerful dimensionally intersecting entity. Very ancient,
Mhm.
extremely powerful, and a very odd combination between angel, or what did I call him? Um, Something like the black seraph of manifold wings and eyes, or some crazy uh you know, some crazy thing like that. But that's basically in a nutshell of and he can also has this form where it's like all these wings and eyes in one almost pyramid form, and then they can scatter and become thousands of different ravens or birds that now can go into all different dimensions and watch over just all sorts of things. So
Yes.
I will share that.
Yes.
Sounds like
That,
you can relate to that.
very, very, very much so.
Yeah,
Um, Eyes, ears, and wings.
yeah,
And to me, that was like vision,
yeah,
comprehension, and
yeah,
access.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
I'm speechless. Yeah,
yeah,
well, first of all, thank you for the kind words.
yeah,
That truly means a lot.
yeah,
But for me, Azazel, the first time I worked with him, the first thing was like, okay, this isn't just another angel.
yeah.
This thing is so much older than
Yeah.
maybe even religion itself.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. This is something that's just kind of the only thing I can even related to is like some crazy vision out of Robert E. Howard, of like some magician in some crazy alternate universe just conjuring some crazy dimensional planar intersecting super ancient god being thing. I don't know what, but I mean, you know what I mean? It's like
Yes.
it's something that's like almost out of like literally out of fantasy, but it's not fantasy. You
Yeah.
see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And the ancient mind that's in there is like, whoa,
It's a trip. Yeah.
it is a trip,
Yeah.
and that eye is just like,
Yeah. It's almost like it has a, I don't know how to explain it other than I don't know how to explain it.
I
I'm
don't
just
either.
gonna leave it at that. Awesome. So, are there any other entities, other than Lucifuge and Azazel, that you feel directly connected to, or?
I've had interesting experiences with Abaddon
Uh-huh.
recently. I've
Okay.
had interesting experiences with Belial, um, Belphegor.
Mhm,
They're all different.
mhm.
And I would say probably the most intriguing experience lately has been Adam Belial.
Okay.
Okay, that's
Okay.
probably been the most intense, wild, mind-blowing experience that I've probably had thus far. I mean, I can't remember because there's been so many intense experiences, but this has been like, whoa.
I can imagine he, to me, almost represents the antithesis of mankind. I mean, uh, Belial representing worthlessness, and Adam being like what, spirit and blood or something like that. And when I first started working with him, I thought that I had conquered my depression. And then I
Yeah.
started working with him, and I had to learn how to transmute my depression and like suicidal thoughts and like
Mhm.
toward my lower ego
Yeah,
almost. And once I did that, it was like, whoa, it was like a gift.
totally.
Such
Yeah.
an intense energy. I've only
Adam
worked with him a
Belial,
few times. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I mean, just my take is that this has been one of the most powerful alchemical energies that I've had to deal with so
Mhm.
far.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why I was sort of breaking the name down because it's a formula for
Yeah.
or not even transmutation, but almost calcination.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And
Okay.
it's been learning how, because his level of quote unquote destructiveness, I think could lead a lot of people into megalomania or depression or suicide or
Mhm.
insanity. I do have to
Mhm.
admit that.
Mhm.
But luckily, I think I prepared, and that's the thing with this work. It's all about preparation.
Yes.
How good is your preparation? And that depends and that will determine the kind of results that you have.
Yeah.
And that's why it's better to make little passes and over time. Like if you're just a beginner, just make little passes gradually and then take some time off and meditate and ask what kind of conflicting feelings are you experiencing and meditate on those. And don't just start going crazy until you get overwhelmed and then you just become terrified and you think I'm doomed, I'm dead, I'm cursed, I'm gonna whatever. You know what I mean?
What have
Because
I
that can
done?
happen. Yeah, what have I
Yeah.
done? And so Adam Belial is not one of those things that you want to mess around with. Of course, he's not that easy to quote unquote evoke or activate in the first place. So most people don't have to worry about him
Mhm.
until they get a lot further on in the work.
Mhm.
But definitely grounding his energy has been very eye opening, and it has caused a hell of a lot of chaos around me. Not to me, not to my close family members, but I mean, stuff in my immediate vicinity has been just radioactive. And I can only attribute it to Adam Belial because
Mhm.
of that merging of Satariel and Gagiel is one of the most explosive alchemies on the entire tree.
Absolutely. I mean, and it almost takes you back to the beginning of existence.
Yeah.
Those primal energies, like I said, the unstoppable force and the immovable object. I mean, you combine those energies, that's going to cause an explosion or
Yeah.
something.
if you want to look at it more in terms of the mythology of the Cliff-Off, it's like Lucifuge is the Forge Master.
Hmm.
Okay, Adam Belial is actually it's the adept himself, but it's in the at least this is just my experience.
Yeah,
The adept is the sword that is being forged by Lucifuge.
I
Okay,
love that. I
and
love
then
that.
that sword is given to Belial. Okay, then he wields that sword. So Adam Belial is like the sword wielded by Belial. Okay, and that's the sword that then cleaves the anvil in half. Okay,
Yes,
the anvil that it was forged on. Okay,
yes, absolutely.
those were the kinds of images that I was experiencing. But they're freaking titanic. You've
Yeah.
got to ground that stuff.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? Because it's like you can't be running around like some demented berserker, But now you have a better clue as to what berserkers were probably up to.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's remarkable how many like I don't want to say coincidences, but coinciding experiences. When I was there, I had an image of a sword,
Yeah,
molten sword, being
yeah,
poured into a mold. And I was
yeah,
like, okay, the mold is Satariel. And then it
yeah.
fell down into Hesed, which was like it taking like form and being used for mercy to defend a
Mm-hmm,
village through
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Asmodeus and
mm-hmm,
Golakab. And I'm like, okay,
mm-hmm.
wow, that brings the community of Stigirion and Tifereth, which then makes room for the passion of Netzach, which is the celebration and the intellect of Hod. And I mean, it was just a lightning strike.
Yeah,
All
yeah,
like I
yeah,
wrote it all the way down the
yeah,
tree,
yeah,
and it was
yeah,
a sword image. So
yeah.
I mean,
That's
that's
so
just
interesting.
blowing my mind.
It's so interesting. Yeah. And speaking of berserkers, that is how Adam Belial appears. Okay,
Mm,
like a cross between like the scariest black metal musician you can imagine. Okay, that's what he looks like. And who are they copying? They're all trying to be berserkers themselves. Okay,
sure,
so I,
sure.
I really will say that the image of the berserker magician, that's what Adam Belial is. Okay, and it's that berserker energy. What are you going to do with that?
Yeah, yeah, it needs to be integrated, like you said, and it has
Exactly.
to be synthesized.
Yeah.
And you can't do that without a strong foundation. Like you were
Yeah.
saying, I am a huge proponent of basics, and I myself often try to revisit the basics because
Yeah.
there's
Oh
always
yeah.
more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow. So yeah, the Berserker magician. I love that image. I didn't experience him so the energy was very Berserker magician, but it was like a knight in molten, like glowing molten
Yeah.
armor. And
Yeah.
it's just like his rage was what was
Yeah.
heating the
Yeah.
iron and the
Yeah.
steel.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So
think you've done more Sephirotic work too, and that's also
perhaps
been good too.
I think I've done more than most people on
Yeah.
the path that I've met so far.
Yeah.
I think it's highly beneficial.
Yeah.
You know, balance is key, like you
Yeah.
said.
Yeah.
So
Definitely.
what are some other difficulties that you've had along this path?
Oh, I've had countless difficulties. I mean, it's just and that's the thing. I mean, that's what alchemy is. It's that calcination process and then the solvay and coagula, it's it's
Mhm.
it's constant. And evolution is adversarial to a great extent. Heraclitus talked about strife and being the kind of lord of the universe and all that. Um, so yeah, I think, but there's a creative element to it as well. There's a transcendent aspect to it. You can actually, quote unquote, align yourself with change, so to speak.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially when
Or
you
you can,
recognize that change might be the only constant. It's a lot easier to get on that ride that wave, so to speak.
right. I mean, I mean, maybe the kind of the holy grail of this work is you kind of become change, which is and
Yeah, yeah,
well, I mean, that goes back to the spear point and all of those sorts of things. But even Taoists had similar concepts. They didn't use maybe the same kind of imagery, but I think there was some similar ideas at work there. Tantra is very much like this as well.
right.
Um, so so difficulties have been lots of difficulties figuring out what I believe, what I think is real, what I think is projection, thinking like, oh, is this stuff objective? Are these like deific masks? And I think both views are actually useful. I use both
I, I do
perspectives.
too.
Um, so things of that sort, like figuring out like who am I in relation to this work and what am I trying to get out of it and how seriously should I be taking it? Is this a
Mm.
lark or is this something more serious? Or am I getting overly serious?
Right.
Because that's a
Yeah.
thing too. So all of these things, but there have been periods where I've really definitely been much more kind of confused, and I've been in a more kind of amorphous state than I am now. So I had to kind of experience, and I think we all did experience a more of a breakdown and a dissolution. And now
Hmm.
when we've in a certain, of course, we could always get dissolved again, but still, you do start to come out of that earlier amorphous stage, and then it's like the forging process. The
Hmm.
forging, the blank iron is very cold, it's unusable, it's amorphous, and then it begins to form. And it's really like that. It's really kind of it. I mean, alchemy was always viewed as the acceleration of natural processes.
Sure.
And so it's a little bit different than like modern ideas of science and chemistry, which are like either attempts to cheat or somehow subvert natural processes or to leapfrog natural processes.
Yeah.
Alchemy is just actually using those same processes, but actually just accelerating them.
I
Okay,
love
so
that
there
perspective.
so there is a naturalness to this, except that it's accelerated.
Hmm.
Okay,
Hmm.
like forging, like sure, iron could be turned into a gemstone or diamond or whatever by the natural forces of the earth, but that would take millennia. Okay, so when you have a forge, you can accelerate a natural process, right?
Hmm.
So that's basically how I see this work progress. It is very, very closely and deeply related to traditional alchemy. There's it's just we need to kind of expand our idea of alchemy from kind of this parochial idea of someone with a bunch of flasks and all that. And I've worked with that stuff too. But this is really the side of alchemy that is really powerful, transformative, and constructive. And when you understand this inner side or internal alchemy, then when you start working with flasks and solutions, you're going to have a completely different relationship with those things. And that
Hmm.
I think, or any magical materials, whether you're working with idols or seals or fetishes or
Hmm.
whatnot. Um,
Yeah. That's actually a perfect segue into my next question, which is how important are materials to you in your specific practice?
I found that um, they're extremely useful when you're moving from ascension into evocation.
I agree.
Okay. You can do evocations without materials, but they just don't have the same impact. And it doesn't really I mean, yes, of course it matters what materials you have. But the materials don't have to be quote unquote perfect, or like there's people that clutter their altars with so much stuff that it's like
Hmm.
you can't tell what's going on there.
Hmm.
And so my working is very simple. I've got a triangle, but I don't have it pointing away from me. I have it pointing towards me. Okay.
Hmm.
Because
I like
even
that.
manifestation work has to begin through me. So it's still connected to me. So, and I have my idol, and I use various material sigil seals that I will put onto the circle within the triangle, because that circle represents the void,
Hmm.
right? Okay, so that's powerful. And yeah, and something actually led me to inscribe Azazel around the triangle, and I had never really worked with Azazel before. I mean, obviously it had to do with watching you, because that was around the time that I really kind of created a new setup for myself.
Interesting.
And it's like, wow, this setup has been like ridiculous. um,
Yeah.
It was like getting a Ferrari or something. It's a lot simpler than anything that I've had before, but it's a lot more powerful at the same time. But it's all your materials are always a reflection of who you are and where you
Mhm.
are in the process. It's always a there's always this incredible reflective quality between where you are in the work and what you have in front of you. It's just
Yeah,
crazy.
I
But
love
that
that.
is um yeah, so I love materials, but I don't fetishize materials
Mhm.
because I've always been in tough circumstances. I've got two kids. I've got my wife is definitely she's appreciative of this work, but it's really not something that she wants to delve into personally.
Sure.
Okay, so I've always had to be sort of kind of hygienic or at least careful with my work. Okay, and
Mhm.
that's forced me to do more with less. So I've never had an
Right.
elaborate altar or elaborate setup. A lot of my work has been mental
Right.
visualization,
Hmm.
qigong, stuff like that. But that's been great because then when you start using materials, it's like, whoa, it's like now you're in overdrive. you
Exactly.
know?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
So
I grew up in a Christian household. So like
yeah.
I literally had a little Altoid box in my
Yeah.
closet that I
Oh my
used as
God.
like my working space.
Yeah.
And
The
then
collapsible wand. Yeah.
no, I didn't go that far, but I probably could have with like some toothpicks
That's
and
right.
paper clips or something. But yeah, I don't really have much space in my space, so I am constantly like either scrying or astral projecting or going into the inner world, so to speak. And because I don't have it here, so I've had to cultivate it here.
Yeah.
But then when you do have the space, it just you
Oh
fill
yeah.
that space with what you've built in here.
Totally. Yeah. 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 That's another thing I never got good at was scrying. I just that's something that I messed around with it, but it never really stuck. I always did better with just pure visualization.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I actually use scrying implements visually. I actually just released a video earlier today about
Uh-huh.
how to scry mentally by either building a gateway that you gaze through or imagining there's a window with a curtain that you open. Because like I said, I didn't have the capacity to have these materials growing up, and
Yeah.
I've been into magic for I'm 32 and I've been doing this almost 2 decades. Well,
Yeah.
knowingly doing it for almost 2 decades. So I've had to make do with what I had. So yeah, that might be something to try. Imagine in your mind's eye that you're looking at a black mirror, and then perhaps seeing if that maybe knocks something loose or opens something up for you. I don't know, just a
Yeah,
suggestion, I
I
guess.
see lots of stuff on my own mental screen, but I've
There you
never
go.
really gotten a scrying mirror or other apparatus to. I had one experience once actually with water, and
Mm,
actually sunlight shining into it, and I just started seeing some really crazy stuff, but it never went from there.
hmm.
So
Interesting. Yeah, we each have our own strengths, and um, yeah, I mean, like we're each like you said, we're each perhaps like a combination of spheres or a specific path that
for
is
sure.
manifesting into reality. So
Hmm.
naturally, we're going to have different capacities, I think.
Definitely.
What are some things to avoid that you would recommend avoiding to other practitioners?
I think I mean, the problem with this path is that you really learn by experience and you learn by jumping into it and you learn by getting knocked around. There's really no other way. You can't be too timid with this stuff. Otherwise, you don't really get too deep into it. You don't get any real transformative experiences. You don't, you'll just be kind of, if you're kind of waiting around too much, you might just end up walking away from it or you just will never understand what it's really about.
Yeah,
So
you
you
might
do
walk
have
right
to
through it. Exactly.
yeah, exactly. So there is that aspect. So and I'm trying to think like I guess I would say kind of like what Israel Regardi said about magic in general, which is get do some self work first and do some kind of maturity self-analysis. Like ask yourself, like, are you mature enough? Um, Examine your own kind of morals, your own morality scale, because that's going to be messed with. All of that's going to be tested. Everything, especially your moral disposition. Like you think you're one way, but you start getting tested or you start channeling like really strange alien energies, and you're going to have to, like, if you don't keep on top of that and say, okay, who am I in relation to this? And if you're just like, no, I'm just going to absorb all this, and it's like,
Uh-huh.
uh-oh, don't want you showing up at Thanksgiving. You
Yeah,
know what I
cognitive
mean?
dissonance is a consequence of doing that.
Absolutely. So do
Mhm.
some self work. I think you need to have maturity, a certain level of maturity. And if you have a lot of like gut reactions to like, your religious upbringing, if that was an issue for you, or to your trauma, or you have a lot of unprocessed trauma, and a lot of also just stuff like that, whatever form or shape that it's in. And if you really haven't looked at that stuff kind of in a more safe environment, you got to be careful because this stuff I think can really also trigger a person who is not done a lot of self work or is not as stable as they think they are. It can be a bit too much, you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's kind of what I would say. But other than that, on the other hand, you do have to just jump into this stuff and
Hmm.
really put your foot on the gas and not ride the. Of course, you're going to have situations where you're going to terrify yourself. That's another thing to remember. And each time you get terrified, you have to go into some kind of analysis and
Yes.
go to a deeper place of understanding and really examine all that you're doing and why that you're doing it. And when you come back, you have to be transformed. And that's important.
I think that is such good advice. Man, absolutely. That is such good advice. I mean, I have nothing else to add to that or to even paraphrase it. I think it was very succinctly said. And I'm probably going to need to listen to that on a regular basis, to be honest with you, because it
Well,
is
good.
such good advice. And how is magic typically viewed in your area, generally speaking?
Um, well, in my area, everyone thinks they kind of, I don't know better than everyone else. So it's almost like this doesn't even exist. It's not even on
Mhm.
anyone's radar. I'm not from a Bible Belt. I'm not from a super. I'm, Northern California is an area where, like I said, there's high level of education. Most of it is in a very standard conformist neoliberal paradigm that doesn't even this kind of stuff
Address.
doesn't.
Mhm.
I mean, there are people in whatever these other professions that do dabble in this stuff. I've met a number of them over the years, but in general, the general attitude is like um, it's one of you could say dismissal, and it is one of kind of like, well, if I'm not going to be making money off of this, then why should I even be interested? If this is not going to promote my brand, why would I do this?
If
Okay.
they only knew.
Yeah,
And perhaps it's good that they don't because they might use it incorrectly.
for sure.
That's okay. So, what are some films or literature or perhaps musical projects that you might recommend for someone to learn to attune to these forces?
Okay, well, there's a lot of stuff. When I was a kid, I would say that um, Christopher Lee's Dracula was a huge formative influence on me. I think, wow,
Excellent.
that talk about a vampiric download, man. That's
Sure, sure.
truly unbelievable. And a lot of the Hammer movies are absolutely wonderful. And I mean, they're hilarious, but they're instructive, and just the whole
Mhm.
folk horror thing. And they connect to all that great literature, the H.P. Lovecraft
Mhm.
and the great English horror writers, the Decadents, Arthur Machen, Algernon Blackwood,
Mhm.
Clark Ashton Smith. You want to read about sorcery? I mean, we were talking about Azazel. Now that sounds like exactly the kind of entity Clark Ashton Smith would write about. Okay,
Yeah.
like on the nose, you know. Robert E. Howard, truly, I believe he was channeling some serious sorcery. I mean, there's the hokiness in some of the writing, but there's also moments of like really inspired gnosis, for lack of a better, and Ashton Smith. I mean, no, that guy was like definitely tapped into something. I
Little
call
bit
him
too.
Lovecraft of the West Coast. He's actually his place of residence is just about 2 hours away from me here.
Interesting.
Okay, so I feel his energy quite profoundly. Philip K. Dick, of course, if you're
Oh
interested.
man. Oh,
Okay,
absolutely.
yeah, anything kind of Gnostic, the energy of the spiritual energy of the West Coast. Yeah. And given a more science fiction angle, but also having that deep Gnostic, and even Klepothic. If you've ever read, the Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, or the Valis trilogies, there's stuff there that will make the hair on the back of your neck stand up for sure.
Valis, Valis, like picked me up and put me in another universe. I swear.
Yeah. Oh
I
yeah.
read Valis, and I will just say that there was an extravagant amount of synchronicities
Yeah.
after reading Valis that just maybe we'll get into that at another time. But yeah, Philip K. Dick is one I do not hear a lot about that I wish I heard
Yeah.
more about because he just had such a perspective. I don't even know how he had a way about him that was. I mean, I really do to some degree believe that he had some of the experiences that he talks about
Oh no, he
because of
100% did. Oh, he 100% did.
yeah,
Oh yeah.
like yeah, yeah,
Oh yeah. Philip K. Dick was literally like a Gnostic redeemer in disguise of the postmodern age.
Maybe
Okay.
he
He
was Saint
came, he
Philip
flashed.
reincarnated.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, the kind of, if you've ever heard of the exegesis of Philip K. Dick, and
Yes. Uh-huh.
okay, yeah,
Yeah.
so that's a mind bending ride for sure.
Excellent.
Um,
Excellent.
so there's so many different things. I can't even remember all of them. I mean, music wise, there's stuff like Coil. Um,
Mhm.
you know, some of their earlier stuff can really has a lot of kind of Klepothic energy going on in it. Um, there's lots of things. I mean, people just there isn't any one thing. I think it just depends a lot on how you're personally wired, what you might find inspirational. Like, for example, for me, um, I love this film called Horror Express, which is a later Hammer film, and it's got a quote unquote satanic Russian priest in it, which it was just hilarious. Telly Savalas playing a Cossack. It's basically about this evil frozen mummy that's being carted on a train from Siberia, um, and basically back into the UK. And Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing are now, instead of playing antagonizing roles, they're now bosom buddies. One's the doctor and one's the scientist, and it's just so damn funny. But it's so classic.
That sounds
It's
like an
so
interesting watch. I
oh,
made
you
notes
gotta
so I
check
can check
that
it out.
movie out. Yeah. So yeah, there's so many things because writing is kind of like one of my little side passions as well. So I've read so much stuff, and I mean other things that, like for example, Stephen King's early work is actually quite powerful as well. The Shining and Salem's Lot in particular.
Hmm.
Um, it's Stephen King, believe it or not, also is a highly psychic writer. I believe personally he's quite powerfully psychic. And the things that he does with inner narrative, like getting inside a character's deep, like
Hmm.
almost subliminal running dialogue, is uncanny.
Hmm.
So he really gets in there as well, especially if you're interested in like the more like psychic phenomena and stuff like that. So yeah. It's
Okay.
like I'm rereading The Shining right now, and it's like September. It's taking place in September. There's stuff that he's writing is exactly what my mother-in-law is actually saying in the other room as I'm reading it. I mean, just
Wow.
wild stuff like that.
Well, the
So,
rooms of the hotel could almost be viewed as Cliffa.
oh, definitely. Oh, definitely. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Interesting.
Actually, that is quite a Klepothic novel, and it's probably one of his deepest and most esoteric novels that he's written.
It's one of my favorites. I haven't I've only read maybe half a handful of Stephen King novels, but that was the one that struck me that was like, okay, this is why people are talking about it. This is
Yeah,
why they made a film about it.
yeah,
You know, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So some great suggestions, some that I've heard of, some that I haven't. I'm always looking forward to new material. So I
yeah,
appreciate those recommendations.
yeah. Anytime.
So, well, last question already. What are you looking forward to in the future? Either experimenting with or learning about?
Well, I think you had one question here about something, a practice that I might recommend.
Yeah, yeah.
I can kind of like we can kind of like push these two questions into one.
Oh, yeah. I
Um,
had written down something that you said earlier because I wanted to address it, and then thought I had asked it already. So yeah, recommended practices for other practitioners.
yeah, I think something that I've been doing, and it's something that's hard to do when you've got so many things going on in a ritual, but it's one of the things that I found that's really been amazing tool for um, really empowering an evocation and blending the alchemy or the ascension practice with the evocation. And this is something that is done in Tibetan Tantra. It's done in the Golden Dawn, and it's also something that Jake Stratton Kent mentioned many years ago, which is it's 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 simple on the surface, and that is assuming a God form
Mhm.
before you do the actual evocation. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So when you cast, you have assumed something. Okay.
Hmm.
So that is integrating an ascension practice into your evocation. And that is
Absolutely.
something people forget. I mean, I think more intermediate people, they stumble across this technique on their own, but I'm just giving a kind of a heads up to people who are starting out maybe to think about this. I know it's a lot of plates in the air, but it's really, and you can also separate it and try this out as part of your ascension practice. And that way you're understanding the different aspects of like what deities align with you and what maybe spirit. You can also take on the image of like a spirit of a spirit animal or a
Hmm.
combination like this is I mentioned lycanthropy. Well, this is kind of what
Sure.
I'm talking about.
100%. Hmm.
Yeah, I'm not talking about like running
No,
around
no,
villages and stuff, but I mean in a ritual context. Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
so stuff like that. um Whether you're talking about anything that related to shape shifting, that actually to me is more interesting in a ritual context. Okay. And it's a real powerful way to massively empower, I think, your evocations and also your understanding of the whole magical process, how it actually works.
Very good. That's what I was going to say. It also has the benefit of scooting the ego aside because the ego
Exactly.
isn't the one doing the work.
Exactly.
Man.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite. That's one of the things that I like about wearing a robe sometimes and
Yeah,
ritual or ceremony because I'm donning, it's like I'm masking myself and I'm getting myself out of the way. And I go back and
exactly.
forth with what I use and what I don't use, but I do like to use a robe quite often because as soon as I put it on, like I'm not, Corbin anymore. I'm the one who does the work, so to speak.
Exactly. That makes a lot of sense for sure.
Mhm.
And to also just recommend that if people think about like how a ritual is structured, vis-a-vis like what's happening to you internally and alchemically. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like think about like what's happening in the beginning. In the beginning, you're opening part of the ritual, and that's you're separating yourself from the mundane world. Okay.
Hmm.
But then, okay, so you've created that, but where do you go from there? Do you just start your evocation? No. Okay. And this is where you mentioned goetic spirits. Then you kind of are bringing in that more etheric energy. Okay. But then what? This is, and so somewhere around this part of the ritual, you think about bringing down the God form. And so you need to have like a specific type of invocation that's bringing that energy in. Then you can transition to your evocation.
Mhm.
Okay. And so it's like that structure that's mimicking the internal. Then, of course, you have to
Yes.
transition out of that as well. Okay. And that's also, it's that arc, or the spear
Yes.
point, okay, that you also have to transition out properly, or else you can get all tangled up towards the end as
Yes.
well. And that's not
Yeah.
pretty either.
No.
Okay.
No.
So
Mm.
so that's kind of what I'm leaving people is, see, like I said, the Orthodox Church is very tight on ritual. They have worked out ritual into a science. And so I was lucky to have benefited from a lot of ritual structure. So I approach this type of stuff with this kind of understanding. And also, I studied Tibetan Tantra, and it's the same thing there. There's a really strong correspondence between what alchemical change is happening during what precise portion of the ritual. Okay.
Exactly.
And if you do the ritual without the corresponding alchemical change, it's null and void. It has no potency to it whatsoever. Okay. And so in the West, we should learn and benefit from these concepts that have been preserved and passed down. So there has to be a corresponding alchemical change. And so you're always working together with the text, the construction of the ritual, plus the corresponding alchemical change. And it's an ongoing process of trial and error and stuff, because we're not working within a tradition that's passed down. We're basically reviving an artifact or a relic, if you will.
Hmm.
Okay. that
Yeah.
that's what makes what we're doing so kind of interesting, but also have its own set of difficulties.
Hmm.
We have more freedom than a lot of practitioners in more super traditional settings, but we also have to kind of reinvent the wheel sometimes too, because we don't have the benefit of knowledge being passed down from one generation to the next. So,
Yeah. And some of that knowledge is passed down psychically or liturgically or symbolically, so to
for sure.
speak. And there's only
Yeah.
some of us that can pick up on the depth and the meaning behind some of these symbols.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So I concur with everything you've said about this being an art about mastering basics. And the
Hmm.
more you can master your basics, even paying attention to the type of tone and timbre of your voice, and to see if your mind is running ahead of your words. Well, guess what's happening to your power? You're divergent. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Well
it,
said.
it's stuff like that that you need to understand, that in many ways, you're the kind of battery, and everything that you're doing, these subtle transformations in your consciousness and your awareness have to be merging as well as possible with all the other dynamics that are taking place. And some of these changes are extremely alchemically potent, and
Mhm.
your consciousness is doing things that are like pretty outlandish for a modern person to really understand.
You said it.
Yeah,
Yeah. Potent and permanent a lot of
yeah,
times.
yeah, yeah. And then you have to remember to like interact properly. Like a lot of times you forget your initial, you get so sucked into that ascension tube that you can't even think straight. Your eyes are just rolling back and they're just spinning in their sockets. Jason, what. I had one experience with an Enochian entity that, fuck,
I meant to bring up the Enochian and the Enochian angels and that whole thing. I'm
yeah,
glad you brought it up. Please
yeah.
continue.
It was probably the most insane experience manifestation that I've ever seen, and it's really the only evocation that I would say that I actually wonder if there was a camera in that room, or if I had a witness in that room, that perhaps they too would have seen something.
Wow. Okay.
Or I was in such a hypnagogic, hyper lucid liminal space where I was in a dream state, but I was actually seeing my room as it was. Okay.
Mhm.
Because what I
Mhm.
saw was just so insane And I was just mucking around more or less, Yeah, I had smoked a little pot or whatever, but I wasn't, oh my God, I've done that thousands of times in the past. I don't use any inebriants at this point, but this was
Hmm.
probably about 6 years ago. And I read the Enochian call.
Hmm.
But as I was reading it, I was really getting into that guttural,
Hmm.
weird, angelic, demonic Mesopotamian language that is
Barbaric.
Enochian. Yeah, barbaric. Okay. And it was resonating weirdly in my consciousness and it was resonating weirdly in my body. But I thought, that's probably the pot talking. So I put it aside. So I put the book down. I thought, wow, that was really interesting. And I'm kind of just like fiddling around. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm looking at, I'm right. Maybe I'm looking at my notes or something. And at some point, probably I say at least 5 minutes after the fact, I actually look up and what I see is a small black swirling, almost smoking point, just like it looks like it's way off in the distance, but it's actually in my room. And the wall is only like 4 feet away from me. But it looks like it's coming at me from this great distance. Okay. And there's this black, it looks like a black smoking flame. And it's just coming, and it's just getting closer and closer. And at this point, I'm just like freaking out. Okay. And by the time it's in my face, it's like a freaking whirling desert cyclone with lightning flashing all around the sides of it. I don't know if it's sandstorm or what. And this thing is hovering out of it with hair flying everywhere, eyes that are flashing crazy pink lightning. And oh my God, the energy of this thing, I thought I was just floating off of the floor. I couldn't even, but I started talking to it in freaking old English. Okay, like I'm sorry, not old English, Elizabethan English. It was so weird and random. I could, and the stuff that I was seeing, it was coming at just thousands of miles per hour. These powerful, weird, like roaring voices.
Hmm.
Okay. And it was saying, arise the first, the parts of the earth. And it was just like this thunderous shit. Okay. It was like the walls of Jericho were crashing down. And I was seeing these huge labyrinthine structures with blue light all around. I mean, it was just insane. And this thing is just whirling in front. I'm thinking, oh my God, what is this thing going to do to me? But and here's the crazy thing. So I don't know how long this went on for. I lost complete track of time and space as well. But all I remember is that when it left, it didn't recede back, but it spiraled up.
Like into the ethers.
Yeah,
Huh.
it came out in a linear fashion, but it spiraled out. I mean, spiraled upwards. And it was just, whoa.
That is absolutely fascinating. And
Yeah,
it's funny that you were speaking Elizabethan English because it's like John Dee and Edward Kelly like carved a niche into our consciousness,
yeah,
like for these things to exist. So when you
yeah.
open that, like you're sort of opening one book opens another, so to speak. Yeah.
I mean, it seems so contrived that I would do that, but I wasn't even trying. It was just like this stuff was just coming out in this illicit. It was just so weird. So yeah, that's probably the most extreme event that occurred. And like I said, oddly, that was probably around 6 or 7 years ago, which kind of did jumpstart the rest of my practice. If I look at it symbolically, of course, there were long periods from that experience where I um, basically wasn't doing any magic at all. I was involved in other things. But I have to say that moment, that experience, um, it it warped my consciousness. It did something to me. Who knows what kind of weird gates that it opened up? But one thing that it did do was, and I will say, I did have a dream a few years later that I believe was related to that experience. We can
Okay.
talk about that another time.
Okay.
Um, but the it's not a secret or anything. I just don't want to, you know, get too far off track here. Um, but I think that experience kind of opened my mind to what's possible, or it opened my mind to the idea that all the stuff that I thought might be real as a kid when I was hearing fairy tales, and now as an adult, I'm thinking, wow, it may actually be more real than I thought as a kid, except now I don't have the filter of a kid's imagination to deal with it. Now it's like it's all ripped off. What do you do? You know?
You try to integrate and synthesize.
Yeah.
If
And
you
I'll tell you,
can.
Enochian is something that I it's funny. People will work with the cliff off and they'll still keep Enochian stuff at arm's length. Have you
Right,
run across that?
absolutely. Yes, I have. Yeah, absolutely. And I have never experienced Enochian entities as not super terrestrial or extraterrestrial. There is something so alien about them. And every time I work with them, it's almost like I have to remember who I am again,
Yeah.
like to work back into this world
Oh
because
yeah.
my mind was so
Oh yeah.
far
Oh yeah.
from the
I tell
norm.
people, you want to know what Enochian is? It's a dead alien supercomputer at the edge of all known universes with crazy mechanical spirit demon things running around through it like empty processing programs. Okay, that's the best explanation.
100%.
Yeah, you get that feeling
Absolutely.
too. Yeah,
Yes, I
it
could
is
not
just
have explained it better.
yeah. Okay, and it's just like these things are like computerized. They're but at the same time they're like hyper intelligent. At the same time they're like some dead technology that hasn't existed for millennia and it's just running on some weird automated loop. um it is just weird, and I'll tell you, the cliff off is like, oh wow, this is so much more familiar and relaxing, you know,
Yeah, at
seriously.
least the cliff off pulls from your own experiences and from
Yeah,
humanity's
yeah,
experiences. The
yeah.
Enochian has nothing to do with
Oh no,
humanity. And
no.
I think it only like barely intersects with our universe,
Oh yeah.
maybe.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I am actually terrified to work with it because especially once your magical abilities start coming online, you don't necessarily want to plug into something so powerful and so alien. And the dream that I had was basically proof of what could happen. And it was basically the most terrifying dream I had in my life. I've never woken up screaming before. Okay.
Mhm.
And what it was I dreamt that I was in a very liminal dream. You can often dream that you're in your own room.
Sure.
Okay. So it's like this blue light is shining through my windows. Okay. And it's coming through the blinds. Okay. And as I wake up, as I get out of bed, um, there's this roaring noise outside. And it sounds like there's a bunch of helicopters and they're shining their
Or a
spotlights.
UFO.
Yeah. Okay. And these crazy, okay. So somehow, and then my house like sort of transforms into like some other larger complex. And I end up on the roof of like this apartment building or something. And what it turns out is it's not a helicopter, but it is some god awful, just titanic entity that is so huge and so terrifying and so brightly lit that I can't even look at it. And it is speaking in the most unbelievable, earth shattering tones. Okay.
Mhm,
It
mhm.
sounds like thousands of nukes going off at once, or it sounds like huge mountains collapsing. And what's creepy about it is there's a mechanical quality to it. Okay. and that's probably the most unnerving part of it. And that's what connects it back to Enochian to me, because Enochian to me has this weird technological thing to it. And these are like hyper intelligent, weird alien computer programs. And these are like sentinels within some kind of hypercomputer. Okay. That's the
Mhm.
only thing that I'm at a loss for metaphors and descriptions, but that's what it feels like. And that's kind of when I hear that mechanical quality, um, I'm thinking Enochian. It's a kind of it's an interesting tell that whenever I probe more deeply into the Enochian space or system, I always encounter that they have the cube
Mhm.
that John D and that cube to me is like a symbol for that whatever thing, that hypercube or
Like a
computer or
motherboard.
yeah,
Yeah.
like a motherboard. I don't really know that much, but all I can say every time I've kind of probed it and kind of interacted with it, I always get this weird experience of like some like intelligent hybrid programmed sentinel things. There's some dead techno. I know it sounds like a science fiction thing, but that's the best that I can. And I'm like, I don't know if I really want to interact with that on a long-term basis. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah. It can be maddening. I get it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Now, that's not to say that maybe this stuff isn't somehow related to the work or to evolution, and that we're not somehow like connected to this supercomputer or whatever. I really don't know. I'm not into that kind of speculation a whole lot, but it does seem odd when I look at my own history that okay, so I get this weird Enochian manifestation, and then look how my life unfolds after that. If I start looking and I thought, okay, can I really say that my experiences now, even with finding the cliff off and working in that with that material, is that really not connected in some way to this experience? I don't know.
I don't know, and it might be different for each of us. Although I have a sneaking suspicion that it's not. What the only experience that I've had that is similar to what you're talking about, with that the booming noises and the lights. I was working with a Hennebe, or however you want to pronounce it, the sort of overarching angel of the Tablet of Union.
Uh-huh.
I was just vibrating the way I pronounce its name over and over and over. And the next thing I knew, like it was like I hit my head on something, and I was just seeing these flashing lights, and I was hearing a language that my ears didn't understand, but like that my heart could remember. And it
Mm-hmm.
was just, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it felt like they were, I had this image of spirals, and I kept thinking DNA, DNA. And then I had this like revelation that maybe these were the entities that like subtly interfered with our consciousness and our DNA over time.
I'm yes. In a word, that's I don't know if you've seen Ridley Scott's Prometheus.
Yeah.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
that's the energy right there.
That's the
Okay.
exact energy. And I think he knows that too.
Yeah, yeah, he must because that's just too clear. Whether you want to talk about the whole Anunnaki thing, but again, I tend to stay away from conspiracies and rabbit holes. But at the same
Same.
time,
Yeah.
I do have to say that when I say Anunnaki and then I put the word Enochian next to it, I do feel a sympathetic vibration,
Yeah. You
resonance.
said it.
Yeah. Okay. So you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's weird, it's creepy, but it is what it is.
Yeah, and I steered clear from it for a while because of how alien it felt. I didn't know how to integrate that into my practice. I'm like,
Totally.
here, and then so eventually I came up with like ancestors, angels, aliens, and artificial intelligence is like the
Yeah.
alliteration that
Yeah.
I use.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to go to that weird artificial intelligence place with this Enochian stuff. You will eventually run into it. And it's like, that's harder to integrate than just
Really?
about anything else, you know?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I feel like I've done enough speculation for one evening.
Yeah, totally.
Well, man, what was there anything else that you wanted to cover while we've got you here?
Gee, no, I think we've done a pretty good job.
I'm going to be watching this one more than once. I can say that for sure. Awesome. Well,
Same
thank you so
here.
much, John, for taking the time to speak with me, to share your experiences, your opinions, your perspective. I thank you immensely.
Oh, likewise. This has been really great. I appreciate the just what it takes to put yourself out there like that. That's I really admire that.
Well, I suppose I do it out of compassion and understanding and love for the evolution of consciousness in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah. Same here.
So, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think that's why we're all doing it, probably, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah. Enochian
Well,
entities notwithstanding.
exactly. Yeah, I wonder what kind of dreams I'm gonna have tonight, man.
Oh
Oh boy.
man. Yeah.
Well, again, I thank you for being here, and
Yeah.
I wish you, health, wealth, and happiness and blessings. And I hope you have a great rest of the week, and hopefully we'll have you on again sometime in the future to sort
Yeah.
of pick up on some of these things.
That's right. Sounds really good. Okay. I appreciate
Awesome.
it. Take
All
care.
right.
Bye
You
bye.
too. Thank you.